Today we're going to be talking about the inner child versus the ego. Now this may seem like a pretty random or perhaps unimportant topic, but I assure you this has a deep impact on not only your inner healing, but the level of love, peace, and joy you can experience in your life. So it's really important to distinguish between these two quote-unquote entities, so that in understanding that, your spiritual path can have as much clarity as possible. Because when there's clarity in your spiritual path, in your pathway towards embodying your highest destiny, it creates a deep harmony in all things that you can experience, in all things that you can attract. On the contrary, I found that the ego and inner child is often taught in an unhelpful way for some people. And when it's taught in such a way and this clarity is lacking, it can lead to extraordinary existential fear, doubt, anxiety, and confusion. So that's why this is such a powerful topic. And today I really want to give you that clarity, particularly if you're a more energetically sensitive soul like myself, and you prefer a more heart-centered, progressive style of teaching and understanding these concepts. Nothing opposed to the more traditional sort of styles of teaching about the ego, etc. Nothing against them at all. In fact, they've been valuable to me as well. But this approach is particularly more heart-centered and progressive, and based on more modern spiritual teachers that I've come across, and also deep awakening experiences and mystical experiences that I've had on my multi-year journey along my own spiritual awakening pathway. So that's really what we're dealing with here. So I want to place in that disclaimer or that caveat that this is based on my own truth. And if it resonates with you, that's perfect. But if it doesn't, well then just feel free to let any of this go when it comes to your understanding of what the ego is and what the inner child is and how this relates to your spiritual path and your happiest life. So we begin with the source, or God. That's what we've got up the top there. In my experience, when you tap into the source, or what God is, it's infinite love. It's infinite love. It's the spark of all of creation, which is the infinite manifold expressions of consciousness. This being one of them right here, what we all are. Everything is this consciousness radiating from this source of infinite love. That's what God is. And so that's at the absolute level what you are. That's your highest and in some sense your only true identity in an absolute sense. And then so we move from the source into the soul. Now the soul is in a relative sense what you more accurately can be described as a human being. The human part is your mind or your body, and the beingness part is your soul. And we could call the soul consciousness, the pure awareness, but it's that eternal part of you that's non-physical and goes through many incarnations as it evolves and awakens itself back into recognizing its divine origins as the source consciousness or God. So you, in a relative sense, are a soul. In an absolute sense, you are the one creator, you are the one source, you are God. But already we're noticing that distinction. So traditional teachings will focus more on only identifying you as the absolute truth, as the source, and defining ego in relation to that. That's how it's traditionally taught. But the way I will be teaching it today, with understanding what the ego is and the inner child is understanding that there's a relative truth about what you are as a soul. And in understanding that, we can then integrate ego, inner child, and soul and see how that then can be all put together in such a way that it leads you back up to the source you are. So I just want to make that distinguishment that there's absolute versus relative, and the soul and the inner child and the ego all function within the domain of the relative truth of what you are, whereas the source, that's the absolute. I think I've beaten that point to death, and that's a point down there. I was meant to talk about this all the way after this, but I jumped the gun. Okay, so let's move into the soul that you are and look at what the inner child and what the ego are. And they're both phenomena that arise as a consequence of you being a soul. So they're kind of aspects of the soul that arise within the soul at the various points in the soul's evolutionary journey. So typically you begin with an ego and then you move into an inner child. That's what happens in a soul, in the soul you are. So if we look at the soul having a personality, then the inner child would be the innocent personality. This is your unique expression. This is who you are, who you came to celebrate yourself as, with all your idiosyncrasies, your unique gifts, your unique traits, etc., as a soul that you are, as the human being you are. The innocent personality. Whereas the ego is the inflamed personality. These are all the aspects of yourself that you're not. These are all the traits that you don't feel like resonate with your highest, most aligned expression. And that's because the ego is when the soul's personality is inflamed. It's misperceiving reality and what it is. And so these toxic tendencies and inflamed kind of expressions arise. And one of the key misperceptions of the ego, or this inflamed personality that the soul temporarily experiences in itself, is due to the misperception that it is only the mind and the body. So as ego, the inflammation is caused by being completely focused on thoughts and completely focused and identified with having a body. And when you're only a mind and a body, you're not an infinite being that's an expression of the source. You are a fragile, limited being, and thus deeply embedded in the ego personality structure are these existential fears of death, of its worthiness, of its lovability. And so that's what creates this inflammation, because the ego goes about with these deep misperceptions and is always trying to bolster itself up and protect itself so that these fears are not confirmed. Whereas the reason when we move into the inner child and we call it being innocent is because it has a purity there. And that purity is generated because within the inner child personality construct, it's become aware that to some degree that it is the soul, and that the soul itself is connected to the source. So it's become tapped into the divine love of its source, and it recognizes that it's infinite and eternal, and this recognition soothes that inflammation instantly. It's like putting a nice cool flannel across your head on a hot day. Instantly it soothes you and you relax, and at a deep level you can let go and you return to the innocence. So moving on, when you do have an awakening experience, however this happens, and it can happen through deep suffering when you're consumed in an egoic personality structure, like an Eckhart Tolle awakening is so consumed in the suffering that it just sort of breaks open and you have an epiphany that you're the soul and the source to whatever extent. Or it can happen when you're loving and aligning yourself within, you're healing, and then from this place of alignment, just like a flower blossoms, you open up to the soul and source. So it's more of a positive way of awakening. But when you have an awakening experience, and this is my own personal experiences I'm talking about now, when you awaken to the fact that you're a soul and a fragment or a spark of the source consciousness, what you'll notice is that the inner child remains with awakening, whereas the ego dissolves. So the inflammation and all those toxic tendencies and perceptions, misperceptions of the ego, they all dissolve. But what happens is, after an awakening, you still have that uniqueness there. You still have that innocent essence there, and that's the inner child, which is the soul's innocent personality. This personality isn't necessarily something you're overly identified with, it's just a spontaneous thing. And it expresses itself, your uniqueness expresses itself after an awakened state as your inner child with spontaneity. And it's merged with a divine will at that point. So you're just flowing with life. But nonetheless, you can be having a deep awakening and experience a sense of a personality there still. it's just integrated. And we'll talk more about that in a second, because you can also have no need to have any sense of personality at all, not even the inner child, but we'll talk about that in a second. The inner child feels clear and open. This clarity comes from the fact that it doesn't always have to think all the time. There aren't always thoughts there. And in that clarity, there is the openness, which means that there's presence, there's living life with life. Not lost in the mental talk that is associated with ego, but rather there's more of a choice to think, to be, and in that openness, when you're simply being, the soul's awareness starts shining in, and you start seeing life as that witness, as the soul awareness, as the soul consciousness. So it's clear and open, and it feels beautiful. On the contrast, the ego is noisy and feels narrow. So noisy is obviously the mind chatter, constantly thinking, those autopilot thoughts. And narrow, what I mean by that is you actually feel constricted in your body and in your consciousness. Have you ever been really thinking about something deeply, like pondering some life challenge or solving some problem, and you can actually feel yourself like narrowing in and fully focused, and then you come out of that task and go, whoa. That's the whole idea of when you're in ego, it feels more constricted and narrow and myopic in its consciousness. And that can also actually physically manifest in your body in terms of tension and stress in your muscles, tight muscles and things like that. It all kind of has a mind-body mutualistic relationship and connection. But it's noisy and narrow. And so in this clarity and openness, the kind of thoughts that are there are aligned in the inner child, which mean positive, joyful, loving, caring, productive, expansive thoughts. On the other hand, when you're in the identity of an ego and you're in that inflamed personality structure, you experience the misaligned thoughts, which are all those thoughts that bring anxiety, doubt, fear. They're controlling, they're these automatic, obsessive thought loops. And really the mind's just a chatterbox. We've all experienced that many, many times in life, when we're completely consumed in this mental gymnastics. And it's a very unpleasant thing. It can cause deep suffering. Or when it's non-preferred, you can be sure that it's the misaligned thoughts are coming from ego. And really, I want to jump down a couple of points right now, and I probably should have put this earlier, is a really clear way to put it is, when the soul is healed and integrated, its natural personality is that innocent inner child. So it's a sign that you're healed and integrated. Whereas when we're more in ego, it's a sign that we're unhealed and unintegrated. And there's still the inflammation there. There's still the misperceptions there. There's still the healing work to be done. So it's really simple to see that the degree to which someone has healing to do, has deep trauma to do, has misperceptions and limiting beliefs and all of these kind of things, they'll be more in the density of ego, and thus they'll be in that inflamed personality structure as the soul they are. Whereas when the soul becomes healed and integrated, the personality structure that is there is just that natural, spontaneous uniqueness known as the innocence of the inner child. And really, they're not binary. So you're not really fully in ego, fully in the inner child or the aligned state where you're awoken to the soul and the source. I mean, you could argue you can be, and perhaps there is such a thing as full enlightenment where you can be fully on one side or the other, but I prefer and see it more valuable to look at a degree, a threshold. So the more healing work you do, the more you move onto this side. The more you align, the more you move onto this side. And the less and less of a pull the ego has, and the more and more conscious you become and aligned you become on all dimensions of yourself. And as a side note, the more this happens, the more high your frequency is, and the more you start manifesting and attracting in a better life. So that's why it pays to be more conscious, because the more conscious you are, generally the more of a conscious co-creator you can be, and you can create amazing experiences in your life. Okay, so jumping back up, the inner child has a capacity to be both self-focused and other focused, meaning literally it can care about other beings. It has a capacity to be compassionate, loving, considerate, and can think from other people's point of view and remembers them and wants to treat them well and serve them. And this capacity to think about others really arises from the love that the soul feels when it starts awakening to the source. Because when you feel that love and you feel the profundity of that love, there's a natural, instant tendency to want to serve and be a positive force in the world, because you literally realize that as the God that you ultimately are, or as the source you ultimately are in your enlightened absolute nature, that is your essence, is to only be that selfless, radiant love and light. So the more you experience that, viscerally experience that, and awaken to the fact that you are the source and that you are a soul, the more naturally you come out of a self-focus and can serve others and be there for others in greater degrees. You can also be self-focused. So this is when you can still look after yourself, set healthy boundaries, and function in ever more conscious ways. That's all to do with the inner child, or the aligned, healed nature of a soul. On the other hand, surprise, surprise, the ego, or the inflamed personality structure of a soul, is self-centric, and this self-focused, biased identity is all-consuming. So the more dense the ego is, the more literally one can only think about oneself, because that soul being trapped in that egoic identity and being run by those patterns, which are primarily to do with the thoughts that run on all these non-preferred thought loops that cause all these non-preferred emotions we spoke about. That's an all-consuming process. So when you're all consumed in that, naturally, how can you focus on other people? How can you break into a higher consciousness awareness? And how do you have any chance of recognizing your spirit, the spiritual dimension within you, when you're completely consumed by these traumatic, unresolved patterns of ego? That's why it's self-centric and all-consuming. And obviously, the more self-centered and traumatized and inflamed the soul is, the more it's prone to doing acts of unconsciousness, which can be these heinous acts that we witness around the world, sometimes in events that happen that kind of shock us and make us realize that more healing's got to happen, and more of this information's got to disseminate for the very healing, so that we can live in a world of peace and love and high consciousness unity, rooted in the awakening to higher truth and ultimately the source. So really, this self-centric thing is never ending. There are no breaks from it. It can almost just be a constant thing of just being completely unconsciously run by these egoic programs and conditionings in the mind and the body. And what I will say is that even though the inner child, or the innocent personality of the soul, when it's in that healed, aligned state, can have a sense of personality and even self-reference itself if it needs to, for functional, practical purposes, it can also focus on other beings. It also can focus on neither. So the inner child, or that innocent personality of the soul, doesn't even need to be functional or expressive all the time. And so what we're really talking about are the advanced states of enlightenment, where the soul takes its awareness away from this relative identity and expression of itself as an innocent personality that the inner child is. It takes its awareness from that, and it can just place its awareness only on itself as the source and rest there. And perhaps some enlightened beings, or very enlightened people, only ever stay as the source, and so they're never disconnected from this absolute infinite love that they are. And so when you're aware of that as your ultimate truth and you're resting in that, you could therefore say that you're not necessarily being that active or aware or focused on your innocent personality as a soul, which is what the inner child is. It's like you're completely in that absolute state. who knows if it's possible to sustain that. I believe there are some enlightened yogis and people that I've come across that only ever stay at the highest possible states, and but I don't want to kind of contemplate too much. For most of us, you'll be somewhere in between for a lot of your spiritual path, where you'll be resting as the soul, you'll have that awareness, and you'll be in and out of identifying with that peace, that expansiveness, that connection to the source, and also practically operating with your mind and your body and your uniqueness as the innocent inner child personality expression. But the key is that you can surrender into the source. You have that openness and that capacity, because the more healed you are within yourself, the more you recognize that to surrender is safe and that you'll only be met by love. And the more familiar you get with going within and surrendering, the more you cross that threshold into that love, the more open that channel becomes, and you more easily be able to connect within and go into this love higher and higher and higher, expanding into that source. On the other hand, the ego cannot surrender to the source typically, unless it becomes completely dissolved in an Eckhart Tolle type of awakening, as I mentioned, where the suffering of being in that state is so strong it just kind of obliterates itself or something like that. But really it cannot surrender. The gravitational pull of those programmings, of those thoughts, of those emotions is so strong that the soul's awareness can only be focused on that, generally speaking, and can only very gradually break out of it through the healing work that can be done. And depending on where you are, that can take several years and lifetimes to work out some of that density. But if you're watching this video, it's safe to assume that you're not one of those people. It means you're likely more open to having these awakening experiences to the source or the love that you are. And so that's really how you distinguish the inner child versus the ego. I hope I've explained it pretty well. As I said, some spiritual teachers will think all this is a waste of time, because what's the point of having a personality when ultimately you're the source? You aren't a person. But that's the absolute perspective, and it kind of ignores the relative, which I think it's more helpful to acknowledge that actually relatively you are a soul, and relatively you have a uniqueness, you have an innocent personality, and we could label that as the inner child. And it's helpful to see there are intermediary phases of your spiritual path, and that the inner child and the soul are part of that path. And I found no trouble in embracing it that way, in terms of having the higher spiritual experiences that the more absolute perspectives are pointing to. So in my eyes, and for some people, if it resonates with you, ultimately it's helpful to see that the ego integrates into the inner child. And during this integration healing process that happens bit by bit, awakenings just happen. So sometimes they happen when you're rooted in ego and you're going through a really dense experience and you're suffering deeply, and you can have spontaneous awakening. Or sometimes you can be healing and loving yourself and doing that beautiful work to honor yourself, love yourself, fix your beliefs, and create that aligned inner state of being. And from this beautiful, healed, aligned state, dissolve peacefully into your essence as a soul and ultimately as the source. So as the ego integrates into the inner child, these awakenings happen, and they can happen at any point. And often there's a lot of back and forth work going in and out, in and out, in and out on the spiritual path. I got it, I lost it, I got it, I lost it type of thing. So awakenings happen at any point. But overall, if the theme and the idea and the intention is to go from ego to inner child, from an unhealed to a healed sense of a personality structure, that's seems to be very fruitful for many people, particularly more energetic, empathic, sensitive souls, in how to view the awakening journey and the spiritual path. And so really alignment is key. So if this isn't aligning with you, if you think this is a little bit, giving a little bit too much leeway to the relative and to falsehood, I understand. I totally understand that. I have studied and practice a lot of the more hardcore self-inquiry paths, which ruthlessly deny anything other than the absolute truth of awakening to that, and nothing in between matters, and it's all illusion. I understand that, and so really follow your alignment. But I would categorize that as a more traditional way of looking at it. Whereas what I'm talking about is more of a heart-centered modern way to look at it. And it can be helpful to see it that way. Because for me, the spiritual path is all about increasing your sense of freedom, peace, joy, and love. And if it's not doing that, if what you're learning about the ego and about the spiritual path, etc., is not cultivating that on the whole, then what use is it? What's the point? And so even the statement which I struggled with for so long, I feel I exist. That's okay. It's okay to exist and have a sense of a personality, and even to say I am in ego right now. Because to deny that is actually when an inflamed soul, as the ego, the inflamed personality structure, gets a hold of these ideas and it starts guilting itself with thoughts of feeling guilty for having an identity, a sense of self. Thinking, I've got to rid my sense of self. I can't have an ego, otherwise I'm not spiritual. Which is actually just more ego thought loops creating more ego. A self-flagellating type of ego, which erodes that sense of healthy, aligned personality, which the inner child is. So it's okay to say, I feel I exist, and feel that alignment, because that how it feels in your body is already increasing your chances to have a higher awakening and perception to what you really are. So anyway, so trust the nuance. This isn't some excuse to justify having a sense of self. This is just a way of approaching the spiritual path, that you can have a sense of personality as a soul, and in that integrated state of honoring your inner child, dissolve into the love that you are. It's a nuanced approach. It's not an excuse. And I've had many awakenings where I've awoken deeply in profound ways to these higher states. And I've seen the personality still spontaneously arising, and that's okay. And so that's what your inner child is. It's your soul's innocent personality and uniqueness that you came here to celebrate as you awoken to the source that you are. So I want to clarify that to anyone that's misunderstanding or feeling bad for having a sense of self or not understanding what their ego is, to know that ego is not the enemy. It's just these patterns that you're healing out of, that you're integrating as you align to the love that you are. Okay, so really that's the distinction between the inner child and the ego. I hope you find that valuable. And remember, these are just my insights, and because the spiritual path is very deep, and there are always, in my opinion, deeper awakenings that you can have, deeper revelations of the love that you are, of the freedom that you are, of the awareness you are, etc. I approach this with deep humility and open-mindedness. And so I say all of this not as a fixed kind of conclusion, but as what I've arrived at so far that's helped me awaken to higher consciousness understanding of myself, and to experience divine love and peace. And so because it's helpful, I'm sharing it, but I'm not fixed on it, and I'm open to changing my thoughts on this at any point, perhaps even to embrace more of those absolute traditional perspectives if that resonates with me later on in my journey. But that's the beauty of the spiritual path, is that you share where you're at, knowing that you can always evolve for that. And whoever's meant to receive this information with where they're at, if they find that helpful, that's perfect. If they don't, it's still perfect. It still serves as a catalyst and a tool of refinement for that soul to understand what teachings will resonate for it. So that's where I express all this from. It's with deep humility and respect for all teachings and teachers. And I just hope that it's helped shed some light for you if you resonate with this style of understanding. All right, that's the video on inner child versus ego. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave me a like, leave me a comment, subscribe to my channel. Stay tuned for more videos on manifestation and spirituality, how you can awaken your soul and manifest and align with your highest destiny and soul expression. And also check out my website for one-on-one coaching and for my online courses. Thank you.